Thank you for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking about a concept called a life debt. This concept of a life debt is something that I've come up with, something that I've seen a lot in my own practice. You can apply this concept into many areas, but today we're going to be mostly focusing on how life debts apply in addiction and recovery. So, what exactly is a life debt, and how does it apply to people? The most basic explanation for a life debt is this feeling that we have that we owe something to someone else. Where a life debt becomes relevant in addiction and recovery is when someone becomes sober enough or present enough to truly realize the damage that has been left behind. Obviously, addiction is one of the most straightforward and premier ways that life debts show up. If after years of drinking that's led to DUIs and health issues, or drug addiction that has affected someone's health or even their own incarceration status, it can become incredibly important to address the drag that has taken place on the couple or the family. So, what is the life debt specifically? It is that sense of shame that someone feels, that they're able to look at all of the things in their past and it all hits them at once. Again, there are some other areas where we can see this, such as affairs, unchecked mental health issues, or other indiscretions. We're going to be primarily focusing on addiction because I think this is one of the most obvious places, but addiction doesn't apply to you or your scenario, or if it's not the most relevant, I would encourage you to consider other significant harms that happen in relationships and substitute it where it's appropriate. So, this life debt, this recognition of fault, this overwhelming sense of shame, doesn't come about in an all of a sudden, short-term way. Typically, life debts show up after long terms of indiscretion, where there's been repeated hurt or pain in someone's life. A life debt might be subconscious for someone if they're using drugs, alcohol, or distractions to keep them away from this type of thinking and regret. But when they're able to see it, they're able to acknowledge the pain and everything that's gone on, comes to the surface, and they come to realize that what they've been doing, the way they've been draining the people around them, has been going on for a while. Once a small portion of that recognition hits them, they can feel overwhelmed with shame. Let me define what shame means in this context. Shame here means that there's something inherently broken or messed up with a person. So if someone's feeling overwhelming shame, they feel that there's something completely broken, useless, or even detrimental. The shame is often pervasive and can infect other areas of people's lives. So if they feel shame in one area, they tend to feel it in multiple other ones, or even in everything. And most importantly, they will feel that things will never change. Once someone is sober or present enough to be able to recognize this life debt that they have, they feel this pull to try to make things right. For most people, it's a belief that they will have to spend the rest of their lives trying to make things right again. It's important here when it comes to life debts. Initially, it can be assumed with a debt that once you pay it off, everything's good. Unfortunately, in scenarios like these, that life debt is something that continues on. Even if everything was quote-unquote paid back, there's nothing that could actually make restitution for all of the pain that has been caused. So this life debt, how does it apply specifically in addiction? When someone is able to sit down often with a therapist, sometimes hospital staff, or maybe just an intervention that happens from family and friends, they get brought all of the terrible things that they've done. Once they've been able to see that it's happened for a while, they have to figure out what to do with it. Now, there can be good and there can be bad. I'm not saying that life debts are completely useless and there's no point in them. Let's look at some of the good things. If someone has been in addiction for a very long time, they should acknowledge that they have drained from everyone around them. That's a good thing. There needs to be balance, give and take in relationships. But if you have been drinking and you have cost people money, you've cost people things, you've caused people stress or anxiety or depression, you need to do some work to help balance things off. Now, does that mean you have to spend the rest of your life? No. And should it be something completely ridiculous in order to pay off your debt? No. But you do have to understand that you are at a great fault for something rather large. Life debts also give the opportunity for partners, spouses, and family members to gain ground in the relationship. I think one of the great tragedies of addiction treatment today has been this whole harm reduction or disease model movement, because it takes the great trauma, the great negative emotions, the harm that has been done by the addict, and it explains it away as a disease or something to manage, and it leaves those that care for the person to hold on to their grief. They don't get to feel resentment because it's a disease. You can't blame someone for having diabetes and cancer. They just get it. And so the addict themselves can feel a life debt, but the partners will never have the bank to cash it. The other thing that I will say about life debts that can be really beneficial is if you have a debt to pay, that means you also have a role to play. You could be open to being challenged, and you can work on things, because if you have a debt to someone, there's still a potential for engagement. If someone writes you off as the addict, there's nothing else for you to do. There's no relationship left. But if there is a debt, it's very likely that there can be a future. There's some obvious bad things in life debts, as I've explained them. I'm going to highlight some of the ones that you may not have recognized. So the first thing around life debts is it can corner someone into a broken identity. Now, that cornering isn't something that the addict themselves will speak oftentimes. I've seen this in many scenarios. I sit down with couples and I explain the concept of the life debt, and the individual in early recovery looks at me as if I've spoken some secret truth that they were holding back, and the spouse oftentimes looks at them really confused. Life debts are often taken upon themselves. The addict will come to this realization and say, well, I must do this now. One of the big issues that I've seen a lot is when I do bring this up to couples, it's almost as if it's obvious, but nobody wants to talk about it. So it becomes this lingering thing, this elephant in the room. Another negative part of life debts is it can feel as if there is no escape. If you're indebted for the rest of your life, where can you go? How can you change? This broken identity will never leave you. I hinted at this before, but in life debts, the offender and the offended can enforce. Early on in couples therapy, I do allow the affected partner or the offended in this scenario to enact some sort of justice. Now, I don't mean that you get to hit somebody, but if someone has been an addict for 10 years, you better believe their spouse deserves a little bit of space to breathe. They absolutely deserve to have you move out, to gain some sort of control and ground in the world. I often relate it to infidelity work. That if someone cheated on their spouse gets the opportunity to gain a sense of control, at least for a short period of time. A life debt can also create resentment in individuals. Initially, An addict will take on a life debt. Sometimes they will speak it, sometimes they won't. And then they create a resentment towards the other person, towards their partner who may not even know that a life debt was in place. And so a resentment can build for a debt that wasn't even brought to the surface, and it can create tension. And a whole lifetime of retribution is left unknown, and spouses come to me saying, I don't know why they're so mad at me. I'm the one sacrificing and making things right. How could they feel bad? And it's because oftentimes the addict has placed this on top of themselves. And you might ask, well, why in the world would someone with a life debt let it grow to the point where now they feel resentment? It's actually very, very simple. Control. You see, if I have a life debt, I have to pay back. I don't actually lose control, much like I had in addiction. If I'm using and I can control my emotions and dynamics and all of that, in a life debt, I can also control the dynamics of the relationship because I'm playing into an influence that I do not make my partner aware of. So someone can build that sense of control and then become upset that their plan didn't work and then resent the offended partner for no other reason than their continued cycle of control didn't work. And now they're left feeling even more empty than when they started because they, quote unquote, tried really hard. I would argue they were never actually vulnerable because they were still trying to enforce the same relationship that kept them addicted in the first place. Life debts can keep the offended partner from ever feeling free or open. And that might sound a little odd compared to what I just said, but let me give you an example. If you are someone who is the spouse, someone in early recovery, and you notice that they are taking on a life debt, it can feel overwhelming or even inappropriate to speak out because they clearly have so much burden on themselves, I can't ask them to do anymore. And so you feel a similar level of coercement or control, except that they're sober. The last thing that I'll say is life debts keep relationships unbalanced. If someone is perpetually in sin or evil, or they have to pay out in purgatory, there's no way for a couple to end up balanced, which is ultimately what we want. In couples therapy or in family dynamics, eventually we'd like everybody to be on the same healthy playing field. That's adults, right? We don't want children being on the same playing field as their parents, but for the most part, we want things balanced. And if you're paying a debt off forever, chances are you will never have the balanced, vulnerable, and healthy relationship that you desperately need. So what do we do with life debts? Do we just all of a sudden cash out or declare bankruptcy or get divorced because someone feels too bad? The first thing we need to do is understand where it's coming from. For those that have been in addiction, they probably hear something like this. They've listened to this episode and say, oh yeah, obviously that makes sense. For partners or family members that have never been in addiction, this might be a new concept. For those that haven't heard of this before, you might take time to pause and go back and listen to this episode over again so that you can really get a grasp of a very common concept that is rarely ever talked about. But this life debt, it's a bid for making things right. That's a very altruistic explanation when in reality, it's a bid for the same control that was present in the addiction and in the relationship. Once we understand that a life debt doesn't actually solve anything, what's left is vulnerability. And so if we want to be able to restore relationships, whether that's couples, families, it has to do with children, we have to engage in everyone's needs. In early recovery, the recovering addict will need support. They'll probably need to go to regular therapy or medication appointments. That part's absolutely necessary. They also need a place to speak up. Sometimes they need to hear it first. Now, someone might say, well, isn't that one-sided to let the affected or the offended partner yell at them? Absolutely not. They need to be able to say it just as much as the person in recovery needs to hear it. They need to be able to hear their partner become incredibly angry, upset, and saddened, while then being able to connect and feel calm. It's an important dynamic. You cannot just cut out anger. You cannot just cut out sadness and expect to have a healthy relationship. If you want things to be balanced, at least in this scenario, you need to let, or the addict needs to let their partner borderline yell at them and then be able to settle. As for that reason, I give a lot of offended or affected partners a lot of leeway early on, because if they've been dealing with this for decades, they can't solve it all in one moment, but they need their partner to hear it. Once we recognize that healing comes from balance and not retribution, there's a common goal. And once both parties agree to it, it's something they can hold each other accountable for. Does there need to be some space, as I mentioned earlier? Absolutely. But once a common goal is agreed upon, you can support and convict each other. Let's say that the partner in early recovery realizes that balance is scary and retribution is an easier form of coercement, and they get back into life debts. It can get really difficult for the affected partner to speak out. That goal then can be referred back to, and the offended partner can get rightfully upset that they're acting wounded and hurt again. The same thing on the other end. Let's say that the offended partner decides to try to force or coerce the person in early recovery into being in a debt again. You don't get to do that long term. Just as much as the person in early recovery doesn't get to lean on a sense of shame for a bit at control, neither can the sober partner. Although that leaning that I talked about earlier is necessary, you cannot do it long term. And so as sessions or weeks or months go on, it should become less one-sided and become more even. That's actually one of the more problematic or concerning issues long term. After years of being in an addictive pattern or an addictive cycle or issues with one another, it can be very easy to click into old behaviors. This is another episode for another time, but that sense of control, or specifically trauma responses, can be so ingrained that every once in a while, if we feel like the bad thing is happening again, we'll respond accordingly. So for couples, a lot of the work long term is just reminding them that things can be okay. Lastly, I'll say around life debts, one of the things that we really want is to treat adults with agency. You'll have to forgive me for a minute. It might just be because of the long paper I'm writing, but when we don't treat adults with agency, for instance, things like harm reduction, experiencing consequences, what we ultimately end up doing is parenting children. Most children may be 15, 20, 45, or 70, whatever it is. When we do not honor the agency for self-destruction, all we've become is a mother with toxic empathy. So we can let addicts continue on their addiction for so long because we don't think much of them. We do not grant them the same agency that we consider for others, and we pat them on the head and tell them, you're probably not going to get better. So we'll just make it as good as it can be. What does this have to do with a life debt? It's encouraging the same behavior. If addicts will never get better, if it's a terminal diagnosis, heavy tongue in cheek here, what else is there besides palliative care? If a partner has a life debt for the rest of their lives, what else can they do but grovel at their partner's feet for the rest of their lives, or up until their emotions can't take it anymore and they relapse. For those that are considering, well, what do I do now? How do I make a change? The first thing I would ask you to do, if you're wondering how to shift life debts in your life, is to be honest about the dynamic of your most intimate relationships. Are they balanced or unbalanced? If they are unbalanced, is it because of the reaction of past actions, or is it enforced? If it's enforced, you need to take a long, hard look, because there is power in being the weak one. It gives us great influence because in our culture, those that are weak are given special privileges. And so, if you are weak, then people can't ask much of you. So for addicts, they can go long, long stretches of their lives being weak, with others not expecting much of them, and therefore they do not have to engage in vulnerability and openness, and especially consequences. For someone listening who has just heard this concept for the first time today, or sat through the whole episode and is wondering what to do next, I would encourage you to consider this dynamic in your own life. There are times that you've hurt people and you feel as if you will never be able to make it right. No matter how much you do, you could never come back to center and they could never see you the same. Well, maybe this is applicable to you as well. Do not let life debts linger. They will cause people to relapse. They will break up marriages, and it will keep addicts childish for the entirety of their lives. And encourage family members and loved ones, other relationships to be much the same. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got something useful from this podcast. If you feel so inclined, you can leave a tip in the tip jar to help pay for the production of this podcast. You can also follow this episode and share it with others. They might find some use out of it. Thank you. Have a great day.